Hello, Montana. Hello, academic world questers, and hello, world. Chris Hislop here again from the Montana World Affairs Council, and this is Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. As you know, over the past many years, the Montana World Affairs Council has hosted a 3-day global education conference called Academic World Quest, where we bring over 300 of Montana's best and brightest kids to Missoula for a 3-day conference that engages them in a series of international issues. The conference is capped off by a knowledge event where teams from all across the state vie to represent Montana at the national competition in Washington, D.C. Now, a month from now, our competition will be held virtually, as will the national competition. But to help our Montana students prepare for this competition, we've had a series of guests on Connect Montana to help them understand a little bit better the issues at hand. So before we go ahead, I want to thank our very generous sponsors for Connect Montana, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. I also want to remind our audience to please open the chat function on Zoom. That's that little button down below on your screen. If you open that, my colleague Julie is going to be in touch with you to see if we could get your email address and to engage a little bit with you on other things surrounding Connect Montana. So please do open your chat screen and Julie will be in touch. Now, let me welcome a very special guest. Karen Ruth Adams teaches and writes about international relations and human, national, and global security. She's published articles and chapters on great power politics, the strategic effects of military technology, and the causes, conduct, and consequences of war. Dr. Adams earned her BA in political science and economics from Stanford University and her PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. In 2014, she was named a super forecaster in the Good Judgment Project, a 4-year study of geopolitical forecasting sponsored by the CIA's U.S. Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity. Dr. Adams traces her interest in global security to growing up near the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons complex near Denver during the Cold War and traveling to China with her great aunt in 1984, when the Chinese government was beginning to allow more Americans to enter the country. She's a big fan and, by the way, a big supporter of the Montana World Affairs Council. Dr. Adams, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Chris. I'm great. Great to be here.
It's great to have you back on the show, Karen. We really appreciate it. And we've got a lot of ground to cover. So I'm wondering if you might start by talking a little bit about why states enter into alliances and why those alliances might change over time. And of course, recently, over the past years, we've been hearing the danger of fraying alliances. What would that mean to us? And then, of course, in his first foreign policy address, new President Biden vowed to repair alliances through diplomacy and restore Washington's leadership position on the global stage. He said, America is back, diplomacy is back. What does that mean for us? Dr. Adams, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me tonight and for those great questions. I'd also like to thank the Montana World Affairs Council and the sponsors of Connect Montana, which is really helping Montana talk more among ourselves and with the wider world. So I will talk about alliances tonight, why they form and why they fray, and put it into a bigger perspective first, and then we can focus on some of the more current issues as we get towards the end of the talk and in the Q&A. My goal is to help the students who are getting ready for the World Quest Trivia game be ready to answer not only some current events questions, but also some questions about the history of alliances, especially in the 20th century and currently. So my approach to studying international relations is to understand the big picture, which we call the international system. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to focus on two aspects of it. First, international anarchy, the absence of a world government, and international polarity, which refers to the number of great powers in the international system. And these two factors, international anarchy and polarity, greatly affect international alliances. So let's talk about anarchy first. So international anarchy, as I mentioned, just means that there's no world government. There is the UN, of course, but the UN is not an authoritative government. It doesn't have the power beyond unusual circumstances in the Security Council to tell states what to do. And even in the Security Council, it's hard to get states to do what the Security Council states argue should be done. So we know there's no world government, and as a result, then there's no one to ensure that states or countries of the world will survive and prosper. So what they have to do is look out for themselves. They have to develop capabilities that will enable them to deter other states from attacking them and their interests. And they have to develop capabilities to satisfy their people so that they don't face revolutionary movements. The specific capabilities states need change over time with changes in technology in particular. The states always need to have some population, some territory, some military and police forces, economic capabilities, of course, and the political competence to develop them and use them wisely. Included in political competence is diplomatic skill, the ability to explain to other countries what's important to the state and to form alliances to address issues of mutual concern. Given the absence of a world government, there are a lot of reasons for states to form alliances, and we see a lot of different kinds of alliances. We see political and military alliances like the World War II alliance of the US, UK, France, China, Germany, and Russia against Germany, Italy, and Japan. Some alliances are more economic, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was recently renamed the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Some alliances are cultural. For example, the Arab League is made up of states in which many people speak Arabic. Some alliances or agreements address environmental issues, like the Glacier Waterton Peace Park between the US and Canada. And then some alliances have all of these elements. And of course, the best example for that right now is the European Union. The EU started as an economic organization in 1951 with just 6 member states, and today has 27 member states and that are cooperating on not only economic issues, but political, military, environmental issues, cultural issues, and so on. So that's international anarchy. And you can see the importance, the need for alliances that arises out of international anarchy. The second thing in the system that affects alliances is international polarity, which refers to the number of great powers in the system. So to understand this, we need to define what a great power is. I think it's helpful to think of analogies when we think about great powers. So you might think about the elephants in the savannah or the bull in the china shop. These are states that are so large and so capable that they may inadvertently or deliberately break things. So how international relations work and how alliances work in particular depends greatly on what great powers do. Also, the lines of conflict and cooperation in the international system are greatly affected by polarity. Usually, we don't see the two great powers forming an alliance with one another. Instead, we see them trying to balance one another's power, but then, the old adage of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kicks in, and, one great power then will often have many middle power or less or weak state allies that it's protecting from that other great power. And then on the other side, the other great power is doing similar things. So the aggressive actions of a great power can provoke military alliances. They can also provoke other kinds of alliances like economic alliances. Historically, up until the advent of nuclear weapons in 1945, military alliances were the most important. And so we would see, France, for example, during the Napoleonic Wars, hoovering up all of these states in Western, Central, and Southern Europe, and then slowly an alliance of the affected states and others who were concerned came together and restored the borders of those original states, and were successful in that in the same way that, say, the U.S. led alliance did so during World War II. So some great powers provoke alliances against them through their actions. Other great powers, or great powers at other times, the same great power, may develop alliances to address non-military problems. So the US, for example, after World War II, when the Cold War got going with the US and Soviet Union, was instrumental in sponsoring and advocating for the European coal and steel community that kicked off the many decades of European Union formation. And of course, the US and China were very important in 2015, 2016 in coming to the final terms of the Paris Accord. Their participation made it possible for globally states to sign the Paris Accord on climate change. So without great powers participating in treaties and organizations and alliances, they don't last very long. All right, so the other thing that's important about great powers is the number of great powers, specifically the polarity of the system. So you can think about a unipolar system with one great power, which we had after 1990 when the Soviet Union fell apart. You can think about bipolarity, from the end of World War II to 1990. You can think about multipolarity before 1945. And what kind of system we have in terms of polarity or the number of great powers makes a big difference in terms of the salience or importance of alliances. So the students who are preparing for World Quest, especially if they're reading pre-1945 history in their world history books, will notice how important alliances were in that era. And that's because before 1945, the world was multipolar. Lots of great powers rose and fell over many centuries, but the system was always multipolar. There were always at least three great powers. Well, alliances matter a little less in a bipolar system and quite a lot less in a unipolar system with just one great power. And so it's not surprising then that we have seen fraying alliances since the end of bipolarity in 1990, and that with the rise of China to great power status in 2015, the United States is beginning to be more aware of the need to restore some of our alliances and explore having some new ones. So, as I mentioned, the 2015 was a really pivotal moment in international relations history. That was when China was restored to great power status. I'm happy to talk about why I date it then, but we'll just take that as an assumption for now and say that, in those 5 years, most of which were during the Trump administration, we have seen some serious shaking up of alliances, or at least a lot of talk about whether alliances, the US's old alliances, are really the ones that we want to have. And what President Biden has done in the several weeks since he has been president is reach out to our historic partners and formal allies and reassure them of his commitment to continuing to work with them on issues of shared concern. He has not yet reached out to President Xi Jinping of China. And I think that this perspective helps us see that, why that would be. His priority is shoring up America at home. The vast majority of his executive orders and important phone calls and so on to date have been on domestic issues. The ones that have been more international have been on COVID and climate. And when he started to reach out to world leaders It was to our close neighbors first, Canada and Mexico, both of whom are major trading partners. China last year was our #1 trading partner, but still President Biden hasn't reached out to Xi Jinping yet. He's reaching out to reassure our historical allies. Now, one thing that has changed since President Biden was the vice president to President Obama is that China has moved into this great power status. This happened in the last year of the Obama administration, but of course it was something that evolved over a long period of time. So 5 years into bipolarity, we're still seeing a lot of questions about what that means, who's going to take leadership, how much China and the US will change their historical relations, and how much they will seek to lead blocs of allies. Now, President Biden has made it clear, I think, that he's not planning to go back to a situation of, close economic engagement with China. On the other hand, he isn't also talking about, trade wars with China the way that President Trump did. So things are in flux there, but clearly we can't just completely reset relations with China. And President Biden has also started to reach out and especially to talk about wanting to lead American allies, restore America's place in the world. And there's been some talk about the US leading a unified Western bloc of democratic states. And so let me just say a few things about that, and then we'll open up for questions. Do I think it's likely that the United States will be successful in leading a unified Western bloc of democratic states against China and Russia? Well, it depends on how we define that. I think that I'm certain that the US will be effective in balancing the power of China and Russia, which is a lesser threat than China, given especially the Russian economy. But do I think that President Biden will put a lot of time and energy into building a new alliance of democratic states? Will that be successful? I would say the answer to both of those questions is no. And I have 3 reasons for that. First of all, many US allies have been democratic countries, but during the Cold War, there were democratic and authoritarian states on both sides, the US side, the Soviet side, and there were some democratic states that wished to be non-aligned, most importantly, India. So the idea of returning to democratic alliances is kind of more nostalgic than real. Second, it's been more than 25 years since the Soviet Union fell apart and US-Soviet bipolarity ended. And things have changed quite a bit in the world. One thing that's changed that is very important for alliances is technology and the frequency of United Nations meetings, both of which make it easy for weaker countries and middle powers to participate in international diplomacy in ways that were much harder before the digital age and before this kind of constant meeting schedule at the United Nations. The other thing that's changed that I think we need to be very, very aware of is that the European Union has developed into a much more robust alliance of European states. And it has its own clear ideas and interests that may make it difficult for the US to claim that it's at the forefront of a unified group of developed democracies. Today's world is just much more complex. Finally, today's challenges are mostly transnational challenges, not so much enemies, but more kind of impersonal threats, things like COVID and climate change. And solving them is going to require relationships and engagement and cooperation among states as a whole, led by great powers. Both the US and China will need to lead in order for these efforts to be successful. So overall, the future of US alliances is a lot more complicated than many argue. And I think also a lot less fraught than many fear. Like all states in the anarchic international system, and like great powers in particular, the US will have to rely primarily on its own devices to survive and prosper. It will continue to work with our partners in NATO and our other security alliances with Japan and the Republic of Korea and so on. And no doubt the US will enter into some new relationships, offer to help other states, and hopefully receive help from other states as well. I think we'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Dr. Adams, thank you so much. I mean, we're always so lucky on this show to get experts like yourself who can help us understand an extremely complex and very dynamic issue, by the way. It's not something that just sits in one place, as you mentioned. I'm going to just remind our audience to please chat in questions using the chat function. I will be looking at those and using some of those, and also my prerogative here as chair to ask my own questions. So Dr. Adams, if you don't mind, I'm going to kick off with one straight away, which is we hear about a fraying alliance and then we hear about restoring alliances. Looking ahead in the current situation, what would change if some of the United States key alliances were in fact restored, whatever that means? What would we see that is different?
Well, that's a great question. I think anytime we talk about, any subject, including international relations, what is fraying? Those are all really important questions. So, the US has some very important longstanding alliances, including NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And in the first week, President Biden, the first international organization head that President Biden reached out to was the Secretary General of NATO. So that's a very important signal saying that from President Biden's point of view, that is our most important alliance, our most important multilateral alliance. Well, you may remember during the Trump administration, President Trump frequently threatened to pull the United States out of NATO and, made fun of our NATO allies, criticized our NATO allies for not spending enough on their militaries and so on. Well, what does it mean that President Biden has done this? Is there anything really substantial there? Well, what he's told the Secretary General of NATO was that he intends to consult and work with our NATO allies on a full range of security concerns, including Afghanistan, Iraq, and Russia. He said he's committed to Article 5, the collective defense provision, and he wants to foreground NATO in terms of strengthening deterrence. That refers primarily to Russia, the original reason that NATO was formed, and to counter new and emerging threats, including climate and health. Notice how China is not mentioned there as a new and emerging threat, but it's kind of a vague language that could be expanded and contracted as needed. Now, how significant is that? Well, it's a big diplomatic change. It's certainly a change of tone. And it is also a strong commitment by a president who really prides himself on keeping his word to say that he is strongly committed to Article 5, the collective defense provisions. So that's a significant diplomatic thing. But when you look at some of the other things, what does it mean? He intends to consult and work with our allies on a full range of security concerns. Well, the proof for that will be in the pudding.
As it always is.
That's right. And it's not so much that I'm dubious about that, but in international relations, as in much of life, the devil is in the details. We don't really know exactly what US-China relations are going to be like. We don't know how US-Russia relations will be. We have an idea that they won't be, fabulous, but, will it be, extremely perilous? Will there be crisis after crisis, or will it be mostly diplomatic tension? That remains to be seen. And so President Biden, like all good diplomats, is leaving himself lots of room to interpret while also giving some strong signals of reassurance.
Dr. Adams, we're getting a lot of chat questions coming in now. Let me read the following. Given that the international system is bipolar, where do you see the direction of the international system going in the future? What countries do you think could rise in power to compete with China and the United States?
Great question. Well, so I've mentioned the European Union, and that's really a big question mark. I would say, if we look ahead, say to 2050, which isn't really that long from now, just 30 years, if we look ahead to 2050, I would be surprised if either the European Union as a whole or Germany as a single state were not one of the great powers. But, how that works out is going to depend a lot on European Union dynamics that have already prevented Europe from rising as a great power. And that main dynamic is that the European Union is an alliance, it's not a single state. And so, the European Union has a larger economy, just barely larger than the United States and China put together, but it's not a single state. So it's kind of misleading to think of it as, a peer of those states together right now. Economically, it is a peer, but because it doesn't have political unity and a single military and foreign policy, it doesn't really act like, and doesn't really have the capability to be a great power. So that EU situation, in order for the EU to rise, would need to be resolved. I would imagine by 2050 it will be resolved, but it's hard to predict exactly how that will work. The easier one to predict is India. By 2050, India will have surpassed China, both in, most importantly, in terms of size of economy. And that is because India's growth rates are high. Also, India has a larger young population. China has a much older population on average. And so the dynamism of growth in India will be much greater. So the easy prediction is to say, by 2050, we'll probably have at least a tripolar world with the US, India, and China.
Dr. Adams, we have a few more questions, but I have to squeeze this in based on your last answer. Mm-hmm. Is there any possibility that the very definition of power in great power also changes? So 30 years from now, the ways in which we determine a great power are actually different then, or is it always the same?
Oh, that's such a great question. So my work, I've written some about the rise and fall of state death. And in order even to be a state, what it takes to survive and prosper changes over time. So the specific capabilities states need certainly change. But, all states need population, territory, some military capabilities, some economic capabilities, political competence. They need to keep up with the important technologies of the day. Those technologies are going to change, obviously. One of the most important changes that we're already seeing is energy technology. International relations during the 20th century and early 21st century has been very much affected by reliance on oil and gas as the propulsion for the world economy, as well as for the materials that are all around us and the things that we consume and use. And that combined with a desire to build up national economies to avoid revolution, reduce trade as much as possible so that we can, have smaller carbon footprints in terms of transporting heavy goods long distances. All of those things I think will have made a really big difference by 2050. But I still think we'll be talking about great powers. We'll be talking about military capabilities, economic capabilities, and so on.
Here's another one from an audience member. What about regional alliances such as ASEAN? Might the U.S. play a supporting roles in a network of regional alliances?
Yes, certainly, and we do. So in addition to President Biden's calls to world leaders, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has been reaching out to to his counterpart advisors in other countries and also to organizations. And one of the first organizations that he called, one of the first organization principles he called was of ASEAN. And so ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Economies. And of course, those are mostly countries that, you know, are relatively small compared to both the United States and China, but that trade a lot with both the US and China, and, you know, whose security the US historically has guaranteed to some extent during the Cold War and, you know, in the early years of China's rise to great power. You know, President Obama tried to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Trade Alliance that a lot of ASEAN members and other Asia-Pacific countries were part of. So yes, those definitely are likely to be important. They're going to be important. Those relationships are going to be important ways for President Biden to signal a resolve to protect our friends from China.
I see. Here's another one. This is an interesting one. Aren't democracies such as the USA at a disadvantage in forming alliances since things can change so dramatically with a change in administration?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, you know, it's interesting. We talk a lot about alliances in the United States, and yet when you start to really think about who do we have formal alliances with, the number is actually not that large. Mostly when we talk about alliances, what we really mean is relationships and engagement. And, you know, in other words, good relations, diplomacy. And so for example, with Canada was Prime Minister Trudeau was the first world leader that President Biden called after his inauguration. Not surprisingly, I think. And, you know, Canada and the US have many relationships, but not one single alliance. So Canada is part of NATO. Canada is one of three members of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Canada is a member of the Group of Seven, and so on and so forth. These are relationships that are very rich and multifaceted, and that are not just supported by the president. Congress has, you know, worked hard to explore and support and monitor such relationships. And so that's why, in spite of, you know, a lot of unfortunate language during the Trump administration about our preferences, President Trump's preferences in particular, we really did not see, you know, these alliances fall apart. They frayed more in diplomatic terms because there were real common interests underneath them. And so that's one way of answering that question. Another way that I think is really important to recognize, especially because China is not a democracy, is that it's often thought that democracies have sort of a disadvantage when it comes to authoritarian states in competing with one another as great powers, because authoritarian leaders can more quickly make up policies or can hide their intentions and maybe carry out surprise attacks, things like that. But what we see again and again historically is that democracies have more staying power and they make better decisions because they're decisions that are informed, often in a not very beautiful way in terms of public discourse. It often is kind of appalling to watch these things be discussed. You know, it's like watching sausage being made, as one observer said in a different context. But that robust public discussion makes for better policy. One person who you might be surprised about saying that was Niccolo Machiavelli, who in the 1500s, you know, we associate him with his book, The Prince, where he gave advice on, you know, basically how an authoritarian leader should run their state. But in the Republic later on, he wrote about how important it was for the leader to hear more views. And so he argued that republics actually have more staying power in the long run because the leader has to listen to others in order to maintain his power. And by listening to others, you get a more accurate read on the real threats.
Well, here's a nice follow-up question to this last one from another audience member. Are there Trump-era international relationships or policies that the Biden administration will not be able to mend?
No, I don't think so. I think that the biggest danger for the Biden administration is what presidential envoy John Kerry was first quoted on lately, is saying we have to really avoid saying, we're back and, here we are, we're going to tell you what to do again. We need a big dose of humility. 4 years is a long time in any international system. 4 years, the first 4 years of a new great powers rise, those are very, very significant years. Now, China has done quite a bit to buffer concern about its rise. I have to say, it's really handled things with a great deal of circumspection and it's definitely stepping on some toes. India and China are having some border conflicts. There's all the island conflicts in the East and South China Sea. But overall, China's rise has been much less conflictive so far than anybody would have expected. And that's really to our advantage because we haven't really had any big things blow up in terms of crises and relationships. And if anything, the absence of US leadership has been missed more than other states have worried about the US being too overbearing. So this is really a kind of a nice opportunity for Biden, but I think he has to be careful. One thing, I would certainly argue, as he has made clear, that climate change is a major challenge, perhaps the most important threat over the coming, over his term and certainly over the coming decades. Well, a lot of other states have been working on climate change during the Trump administration. Last week, President Biden made an announcement that on Earth Day, he would be sponsoring a meeting of heads of state to discuss climate. That's great, but that's a bit of the bull in the china shop too. There's a busy meeting schedule already. Now he's putting this new thing on it. Is he upstaging Boris Johnson, who's in charge of hosting the climate change talks this year? That's the kind of thing that makes it really hard to be a great power. Everybody missed us leading. Biden is now leading, but on the other hand, it's going to be hard not to step on somebody's toes.
Well, let me pick up one last question here, Dr. Adams, from another audience member, also on the transnational points that you're making there, this one on COVID. Have the vaccines served as a type of informal alliance? For example, the Russian Sputnik vaccine being used by Iran and Venezuela, Pfizer, Moderna, etc., EU, USA, and UK.
Well, I would certainly argue that that's a form of engagement and cooperation. And both the Chinese and the Russian vaccines, are quite effective. We know now from some trials. So that's great. And we certainly need all of the states in the system who have the capability to make vaccines to be doing that and to be sharing them. And India, of course, is a very important state with regard to this. India historically has worked very hard not only to develop capabilities for itself, a rather up and coming, but still not very well off country in many respects, and to share them with others. And it's done this repeatedly on health issues. So yes, those are very important forms of cooperation. Whether an alliance comes out of that, really remains to be seen. I think that in terms of vaccines, the most interesting issues have arisen in the European Union. There's a great article in the New York Times today about how, the European Union countries agreed to work together on the vaccines and to share the vaccines that they worked on together with all the members of the EU. That was probably the most significant alliance decision related to COVID. And I think it tells us a lot about the EU's determination to move forward together.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dr. Adams. Once again, we have never in this show had enough time to answer all of the questions and get into all of the very interesting detail that our guests bring. But I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show and helping us understand, at so many different levels with different facets about alliances in general, zeroing in on the United States, China, and these transnational issues. Absolutely fascinating. Any last words to you for our students preparing for Academic World Quest or our participants?
Good luck in World Quest. I see you can take 3 teams. Is that right, Chris?
That's right. So this year, 3 Montana teams will be competing at the national level. We have already more than 200 kids from across Montana signed up. It's going to be a great event.
I think it will be. Well, thanks so much for having me. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks again, Dr. Adams, and thank you to all of the participants. I want to remind you to please chat in your email address to my colleague, Julie, to help us kind of understand a little bit more about what you're looking for in our webcasts. I also want to thank our generous sponsors at the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank, and Allegiance. Now, coming up this spring, we're going to run a Connect Montana on Tuesday nights, 6 p.m. to 6:45 or 7 o'clock every Tuesday. So you might as well block out your calendar now. Next Tuesday, we have a most extraordinary guest. It is Montana's Global Teacher of the Year, Diana Bird. Diana was once forbidden to speak the Blackfeet language. She has now made it her mission to teach Blackfeet and its culture. She's just turned 80 years old and is still teaching. And many of her students have gone on to college and are teaching the language in schools. She's one of the last fluent speakers of Blackfeet, and she teaches her subjects or all subjects in the language. She is an educator who has made a huge contribution and a big difference, and we're going to welcome her on next Tuesday, 6 p.m. Also upcoming in our lineup, former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel will join us. Former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, General Wesley Clark, and Ambassador Joseph Detrani, who was the U.S. Special Envoy for the 6-party talks with North Korea. So we've got a big calendar of events coming up all through the spring. We hope you will join us. It really helps us if you give us your email address. That way we send out these events in digital mailers. Check us out on Facebook or other social media, LinkedIn and Instagram, if you need to know anything more about what's going on. Dr. Adams, once again, thank you. I thank you, all of the academic world questers out there and our audience. Be well and have a good night.